I mean, one of the cases that made me stay in public defense work. I got a post-conviction case out of Lake County uh, for a person who had served 8 years on a life sentence for a robbery that he didn't do. Um, and I could see it was clearly a mistaken identification case. But nobody seemed to be concerned about trying to correct it. And so even the public defender, who then became a judge, said, yeah, that's the one case where I think, I represented an innocent man who got convicted. But he'd done 8 years, and it was like, well, why hasn't somebody done something? So it took me 2 years to get a new trial. Fortunately, he was acquitted and released, but that's how I kind of got hooked onto saying, I'm not leaving until I change the system.
Hello, thank you for joining me in the first in a four-part series of IPDC is turning 50. In this first episode, I'm going to be joined by Larry Landis. He's first training director and first executive director under IPDC's current structure. He served IPDC in that role for almost 40 years. During this interview, Larry is going to share with us kind of IPDC's history and how we came to be and our story, as well as his part in helping create IPDC. So I hope you enjoy this interview. Larry, welcome and thank you for being here.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Awesome. Well, Larry, let's just start with a really general question. Tell us about when you came to public defense in Indiana, and when you came to it, what was the public defense landscape like? What were the conditions that public defenders were working under?
Well, I started in 1973 as a deputy state public defender in the office of the state public defender. I had been an intern in the Marion County Public Defender office during law school, so I had some exposure to it, but most of the work I did early on was doing post-conviction relief, which in many cases was either trying to vacate a guilty plea or alleging ineffective assistance of counsel for the trial attorneys. So what I saw from both my intern experience and from doing the post-conviction was a deplorable state of public defense. All public defenders were at will, either employees or appointed by the judge. Marion County had a system of 4 judges, each hired 5 part-time public defenders, paid $5,000 a year, and had unlimited caseloads, and were patronage employees of the judge. So when the judge went out of office, the public defenders lost their job. It was an at-will employment, but it was also political. And in other counties, it was the same thing. Each judge hired their own, if they had a contract public defender, they hired and they served at will because Indiana is an at will state. So most counties were actually case by case, but there was no public defender offices except in Monroe and Tippecanoe counties. They had just started PD offices with, 1 or 2 people in each office, but that was the extent of it. Otherwise, there were no public defender offices in the state of Indiana.
When I think about when you came on the scene in 73, Indiana had long recognized the right to counsel before IPDC existed, even before Gideon, the long-standing recognition. But we know recognition and implementation are 2 totally different things. Can you tell us from your perspective of that long history, what gaps did you see? You've kind of shared some examples, but what gaps did you see between the recognition of the right to counsel and actual implementation at the county level?
Well, there was a right to counsel in name only because, the decision to appoint was based on the individual judge. And there was no statewide indigency standard, so it was in the eye of the beholder, the judge. Some judges took the policy that if you can make bail, you can hire a private lawyer. So you had to choose between right to bail or right to counsel. And there were no support services. There's no investigators. There's no social workers. There's virtually nothing, and you got an excessive caseload. Compensation was totally inadequate. So, there's just pressure to move those cases because most of the people who are doing it are trying to develop a private practice. They're trying to get a foothold in being a lawyer. So, you want to keep that job as a part-time public defender because that keeps the lights on. Criminal defense work isn't necessarily, you can't count on cash flow. So that public defender job was very important to people who had those because that was a steady income, at least, that they could count on. So, and they were beholden to the judge. So, it's always risky to take on the judge to allege too many errors. And so that's the situation. You had an at-will employment state with public defenders employed by judges before whom they practiced, with no support services. And they were all independent. So you didn't even have a good camaraderie because, in Marion County, for example, all of those public defenders were competing against the other lawyers to develop their private practice. So there wasn't a lot of camaraderie. Nobody identified themselves as a public defender anywhere in the state, really. They were all criminal defense lawyers or just lawyers who did, appointment cases, or they might have had a contract, but nobody had said, I'm a public defender.
Wow. When I think about also you coming on in 1973, I think about all the civil rights gains that happened from the 60s that really ushered in just a wave of supporting due process and due process being provided in criminal cases. From your perspective of being in the system in the early 70s, do you feel like Indiana responded to that national momentum of more due process in criminal cases?
No, I did not see the impact of the civil rights movement. I was obviously keenly aware of it. I was a product of the 60s. I came up, during JFK assassination and Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy's assassination. But no, I don't think it had any effect. What Indiana didn't do that a lot of other states did because of Gideon in 63 and then Galt and Argersinger in 72, I think, or something, 73. I think I came down Argersinger before I graduated, or right about the time. Most states, because of those cases, now had to appoint counsel. In numerous cases, they didn't before. So they had to create a delivery system and a funding structure. Indiana didn't because of that early case law you mentioned. Webb versus Barrett of 1854, I think, said that trial judges not only had the right to appoint, they had inherent authority to mandate payment. No other state had that case law. So Indiana did not necessarily have to create a delivery system. They had one, which was the inherent authority of the trial court. So what had been a strength became our Achilles heel because nobody saw a need to change the system, to create a delivery system.
You shared that you started your career in the state PD office. Can you describe for us what was the relationship between the state PD office and attorneys who were providing representation at the county level? Were they just completely separate? Was there any connection or coordination at all between the two?
They were completely separate, and actually they're kind of antagonistic.
Sure.
Because when you would call a trial public defender on a case, if you're a deputy state public defender, there was always that reluctance to talk to you. They were guarded because they were, concerned you were going to allege ineffective assistance of counsel. They knew that was a primary claim on post-conviction. So there was always that tension that they thought they were being judged. They knew that was a potential issue. So they weren't really always friendly, forthcoming, and there was natural tension there, I think.
Can you, thinking about now the founding of IPDC, can you walk us through the moments or the period when the idea of IPDC began to take place? Who was in the room? Who were the players, and what problems were those figures trying to solve?
Well, in the room, it was mostly Harry Bailey Kahn, myself. I think Carr Darden was involved in it at the time because we were talking about the need for training at the trial level, training public defenders, because as we knew, law school at its best may teach you to think like a lawyer, but sure as hell didn't train you to be a lawyer. And so most of the people practicing law had no training at being a lawyer. So we thought, because there was national programs out there of doing training, that maybe we could be the entity in the state that would provide that training. So Harry Bailey Kahn applied for a grant from the Indiana Criminal Justice Planning Agency. At the time, federal funding was LEAA, the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration. She got the grant. We did training, I think, starting in 74 and 5. The Criminal Justice Planning Agency director, who was the superintendent of the state police at the time, said he would not renew a grant unless training was authorized by the legislature as part of some state agency. So that's what spawned the creation of the council. We said, okay, we're going to have to figure out how to create this training function as part of the state public defender office. And so Harry Bailey Kahn gave me the task of saying, draft some legislation, which was kind of funny because I had no clue how to draft legislation. So I looked at the statute from the Indiana Prosecuting Attorneys Council, which had been in existence since 74, I think. Changed a few words, to make it kind of fit criminal defense, public defenders. Showed it to her. She said, I think she tweaked it a little bit and said, okay. She said, okay, now we need to get it passed. I said, okay, how do you do that? So fortunately, she had been a state legislator, so she knew legislators. So she told me who to contact, Senator Les Duval in Senate and John Donaldson in the House. I did. I worked with them, somehow it just passed first time. I didn't know how unusual that was at the time. And it was passed, and the statute created her as executive director, authorized them to hire a training director, which was me, and we were off and running, doing training. That was the primary focus, was doing training for county level public defenders.
Excellent. That's a great story. I mean, the fact that it passed the first time is amazing, to say the least. When you think back to that room of envisioning IPDC, I definitely hear that training was the driver. But amongst yourself and Judge Darden and Harriet Bailey Kahn, were you all on the same page with the scope of IPDC, or, was there any variant of opinion of what IPDC should be?
I'm sure there were differences of opinion because the primary focus initially was training. And we did have, I think it was 74 or 75, we started the Indiana Public Defender Association, which was an attempt to create a board of directors of trial level county-based public defenders, to kind of bring them in to say, we're not going to do this to you, we're doing it for you. And so once I started learning about public defender systems, I realized, training is not going to fix these problems. Training is important, but we got to deal with the structure and funding of indigent defense services. And there was a report in, I think, 74 that highlighted, many of those deficiencies. So I started trying to push the Public Defender Association and county level people of trying to, delicately tell them why the system was bankrupt and what needed to be done. But I could tell I was getting a lot of resistance because every time I would advocate for changing the system, it was threatening their job security.
Sure.
So you can imagine there's going to be a lot of resistance. So that was kind of the tension in those very early years. Is I was pushing for change because it didn't threaten my job security, but it did everybody else who was in the system because change is threatening. I learned that early on.
Yeah. Well, speaking of kind of that engagement between the state office of IPDC and those practicing at the county level, when you think back about being the first training director and really making out a whole cloth something new, it sounds like you certainly have partners in local attorneys in developing the content. But how were the training programs that IPDC received? Were attorneys hungry for it and couldn't wait to participate? Or did you have to really build buy-in to even have people participate in the programs?
Wasn't difficult to build the buy-in because in those early years, remember in the first criminal code revision was in 76 and 77.
Mm-hmm.
That was a major rewrite. We changed from an indeterminate, sentencing system from like 1 to 5, 1 to 10, I think it was 2 to 21 and 15 to 25, to a determinate sentencing. All the criminal offenses were rewritten. Elements of the offenses were different. So it was a major change. So most of the early training had to deal with training them about the law, about the criminal code. And so, yeah, they were definitely eager to learn about that because they needed that to be functionally competent. And then, I think the procedure code was a few years after that, and same thing. So I think early on they learned, yeah, they appreciated learning what was happening in the legislature, what was all the changes, court rule changes. So a lot of it was about the law, and not necessarily about trial skills. So yeah, they were hungry to be kept abreast, learn, and I think appreciated that somebody was feeding them that they could trust was feeding them information about all the changes going on at that time.
Excellent. When you think back of your nearly 40 years in the role of executive director, what are you most proud of in terms of accomplishments that happened under your guidance, under your leadership?
Well, I think the identity of public defenders, you see themselves as public defenders, and that is a career option. That you could do it, be proud of it, be fulfilled, satisfied, and say this because the work has meaning and value. I don't think that existed before. I think it was a stepping stone. It was I'll do this as long as I have to in order to get my private practice developed. I think now there are people who are saying, I don't necessarily want to go out and do private practice and hustle. I want to serve clients and I want to be my focus, not making money. Because half the time of being in practice, you're running a business, and to me that wasn't as much fun as being a lawyer. So that's one big change. The fact that there's so many public defender offices, and there's a lot more communication between lawyers, cooperation, collaboration. That's all completely different. They've got counsel as a resource center. So yeah, I mean, all of those things definitely are improvements.
That's awesome. In terms of during your almost 40 years in that role, what were some of the toughest decisions that you had to make, and what lessons did you learn from those hard decisions?
The hardest one was to give up my concept and push for a statewide public defender system that was state funded. I tried to sell that in 85, 87, 89. And finally then, after beating my head against the wall for, a good decade, I had to compromise and say, okay, the best we're going to be able to do is get a commission that sets state standards and have partial state funding on the back end, which I knew at the time was not going to be the solution because that's totally dependent upon how much the county funds it up front. And so, that was the weakness that I saw in that compromise, but it was either that or nothing because virtually nobody wanted a statewide public defender system except me.
Back to the question of, giving up on that dream of making the system a statewide, state-funded system. You had no allies that wanted to work with you to push that forward?
Yeah, there was some who kind of understood why the concept, but not anybody who had political clout or muscle or could, and not enough of a mass. There wasn't a critical mass of people who wanted that, and but when I did propose legislation in '85, the only people who came to testify were judges and public defenders, and they were all opposed to it.
Okay.
And I had legislation that almost created a Marion County public defender system. It passed the Senate, but then when it went to the House, the judges got involved and killed it. So, I knew that because I had studied and I had visited statewide public defender offices, and I knew that they weren't perfect. There is no perfect delivery system, but there were so many advantages to having money come, from the state that you could allocate based upon need and population and whatever issues were arising at the moment. The county-based funding is just inherently weak, and it's getting. And I knew when I left there in 2018 or so, it's like 60 counties at the time were losing population and had been for 10 years. So their tax base is going to be lower. There's going to be more competition for those funds. It's not going to get any better. And then with the difficulty of finding lawyers in some of those counties, it was like the future of county-based system, both in the provision of counsel and the funding of counsel, is not good. That at some point is you got to see that the money's got to come from the state, which is, I've always said from day one, I said, I don't understand. It's a federal constitutional right. Federal government pays nothing. It's a state constitutional right. The state pays nothing up front. Why is that? Why aren't people saying, hey, there should be federal money, there should be state money for these constitutional rights? Instead, it's on the backs of the counties. But that's still where it is.
True. It's true. And more counties are losing population even more since.
Yeah, I see that.
Yeah. Yeah. When you look back at your time at IPDC, are there accomplishments that IPDC has made that you feel maybe IPDC doesn't get the credit for having achieved?
Yeah, I don't really know what they get credit for.
Sure.
But I think the creation of the Marion County Public Defender Office was a big one. That took a lot more work than people really realize. How much I worked for 3 years to get the legislation through to authorize it, and then to create the office, having to negotiate with the county council and the judges, and the split between the municipal court and the Superior Court felony division. It was difficult, tedious. I had never had an experience working with county council. That was my first one. I was like, I thought the legislature was hard. Whew, this group is really difficult. But it finally got created, and then Fran Hardy Watson was the first chief, and then Dave Cook, and Bob Hill. So during my tenure, anyway. So yeah, that's big. It went from having 4 courts with 20 part-time public defenders to now, 150 or something. Full-time public defenders and investigators, social workers. None of that existed. So, but there's all of the criminal code stuff, I was involved up to my, up to there with. So there's just numerous changes in the code that would not have happened. And Criminal Rule 24, dealing with death penalty cases, right to counsel, we get two lawyers and, and judge, everybody said, judges are just going to, you can tell them how much to pay, but they'll just cut the hours. And, that never happened. And they rarely ever denied experts that you ask. Before that, you never got an expert. So CR 24 changed drastically defense and death penalty cases. And CR 25 with the right to counsel in all juvenile cases changed juvenile law. So yeah, there's a lot of things that happened that might not have happened, at least when they happened.
That's fantastic. Larry, as you think about IPDC approaching its 50th anniversary, what do you think that the organization should be most proud of, like over all this time? Is there something that just comes to the top that is the penultimate?
I think it's just that the number of people who seem, far more committed to indigent defense, public defender work than they did when I started, when I came out of law school. People now choose public defense as a career. That didn't happen. So they see it as, they experience it as, rewarding work, but now they see it as, this is meaningful, What else could be more meaningful as a lawyer? Making money? Come on.
That's right. When you think of the council, is there, and I feel like I know what you're going to say, but what unfinished business, for public defense do you see that you think IPDC should take on in this next
structure and funding of public defender work? You got to get money coming from the state, and you got to have adequate funding, and you can't do it from the bottom up. You'll never get adequate funding. There's some places still there's too much tie between the judge and the public defenders. They're not independent because the judge still appoints the majority of, or has influence over the board that hires the public defenders. And so there's got to be total severance, independence. But they also need to get involved in, changing the criminal justice system from a retributive to more of a restorative justice system. And recognize that, we're still under the vestiges of this addiction to incarceration. And somehow that's how we deal with crime. It's self-destructive. It's counterproductive. So you just got to start working on changing attitudes of, just because somebody is poor and commits a crime doesn't mean that imprisonment is the best response. It's not. And you got to deal with bail reform. The fact that poor people get stuck in jail and wealthy people don't, and then they're coerced to plead guilty because in misdemeanor cases and many low-level felonies, they get out a lot quicker if they plead guilty, even if they didn't do it. That's a structural issue that you have to take on. If you look at, the system, I could probably, give you another 5 to say, these are structural flaws that are going to lead to injustice, no matter how good a job you do. It's a railroad, and you got to change the system. That's all there is to it. So, I would encourage people, wherever you see something that's unjust, take it on. Even if it's just a little step, even if it's just acknowledging or somehow footnoting it and saying, you know what, this is wrong. We need to change. You can't just hold people in jail because they're accused of a crime, without any more. there's a right to bail. If you're going to have the preventive detention, then have it and have a hearing and make the state prove that they're a danger or a risk of flight, not just because of the nature of the crime. That's insane. We know who gets punished, poor people. That's it. So there's still work to do.
There's still work to do. There's lots of work to do.
There's still plenty for all of you out there.
Yeah.
It'll never end.
Right.
There's always things you can do to, attack injustice, make it more fair.
Well, Larry, you did this instinctively, but my final question or wrap up to you is, what would you say to public defenders doing this work today? Many of whom might not even know the history we're trying to illuminate right now about IPDC and all the great work that you have been a part of, that IPDC has been a part of. What parting word would you give to defenders working in Indiana today?
Make your own path forward. If you see something wrong, fix it. Even if nobody else agrees with you, you got to have your own sense of what's just and fair. And don't be afraid to try to change the system. It's long, it's slow, it's tedious. So you can learn from the past, but mostly you can just look around you. You'll find things that need to be changed. You don't have to look far. So, but you have to make a commitment. It's not easy work being a change agent. I can tell you, 40 years of being a change agent was exhausting, but very rewarding.
Larry, thank you for that. You should be so incredibly proud of the work you've done for IPDC, for public defense in Indiana. And I'll say, as a person who has been blessed to follow you, it's been a real honor for me to follow you and have you, as a role model. So I really appreciate you, Larry, and I really thank you for this time. And IPDC and the public defense community thanks you for all that you've done. So thank you for this.
I'm very grateful. I had a rewarding, meaningful career. So I have no regrets. I'd do it over again.